Northern Ireland contains a lake so large that almost half the country drains into it. Yet the lake is shallow enough for pollution across that vast catchment to become everybody's problem. Beneath County Antrim, miners work through a layer of ancient rock salt hundreds of meters underground. And on the surface, the Giant's Causeway is the exposed remains of volcanic activity tied to the opening of the North Atlantic itself. Even the border is less permanent than it looks. A commission once proposed changing it, then its report effectively disappeared from public view for decades. Northern Ireland looks small on a map. Its hidden story is the opposite. Here are 20 facts that reveal what this place actually is. 20. Belfast has a monument older than the pyramids. A few kilometers from Belfast city centre is an earthwork more than 200 meters across. It is called the Giant's Ring, and despite the name, giants had nothing to do with it. The enclosure was constructed around 2700 BC during the Neolithic period, with a chambered tomb standing near its center. That makes the monument roughly 4,700 years old, already standing centuries before the Great Pyramid of Giza was completed. The familiar Belfast of shipyards, terraces, motorways, and Victorian industry occupies a landscape people were organizing ceremonially thousands of years before Belfast existed. And the Giant's Ring is only the beginning of that story. 19. People were living here roughly 10,000 years ago. Near Coleraine, overlooking the River Bann, archaeologists excavated Mount Sandal, one of the most important Mesolithic sites on the island of Ireland. Evidence there points to occupation in roughly the 8th millennium BC. The people who lived here were hunter-gatherers, using flint tools and exploiting a landscape of river, woodland, and wildlife radically different from the one outside Coleraine today. Archaeologists found evidence of substantial circular huts, showing that these were not simply people wandering through an empty wilderness. Long before counties, kingdoms, plantations, or borders, communities were already making homes beside the Bann. 18. One of Ulster's ancient capitals is sitting on a drumlin. Outside Armagh is a grassy hill surrounded by an enormous circular earthwork. Today it is Navan Fort. In early Irish tradition, it is Imain Macha, one of the great provincial centers of ancient Ireland and the legendary headquarters of the Red Branch Warriors. Archaeology and mythology are not the same thing, and the stories cannot simply be treated as historical transcripts. What is established is that Navan Fort was an important prehistoric ceremonial center. The apparently ordinary hill is actually a drumlin, one of the streamlined hills left behind by ice, meaning human beings later turned an Ice Age landform into one of the most culturally important places in Ulster. 17. 12 squirrels changed an entire island. In 1911, just 12 gray squirrels brought from England were released in County Longford after being given as a wedding present. That tiny introduction had consequences far beyond one estate. Genetic research cited by Northern Ireland's Environment Department indicates that Ireland's gray squirrel population traces back to those original animals, and by the 1960s, their descendants were spreading across the border into Northern Ireland. Gray squirrels compete with native red squirrels and can carry squirrel pox, a disease that may have little visible effect on grays, but can be fatal to reds. An ecological problem spanning much of an island can be traced back to 12 animals released from a box. 16. Northern Ireland has a genuine deep-sea habitat almost beside the shore. Rathlin Island sits only about 4 kilometers from the North Antrim coast, but the seabed beyond it drops with extraordinary speed. North of the island, depths exceed 200 meters, deep enough for the area to contain the only known example of deep-sea bed habitat in Northern Irish waters. Beneath the surface are submerged coastlines, underwater caves, sea arches, and lagoons, physical evidence of earlier sea levels preserved underwater. Above them, Rathlin's cliffs support Northern Ireland's largest seabird colony, historically exceeding 20,000 breeding birds. What looks like a small island off another small island is really the exposed edge of a much larger landscape, most of which is underwater. 15. The famous rope bridge was industrial equipment. Cuilcagh is photographed as an adventure attraction, a narrow rope bridge hanging almost 30 meters above the sea between the Antrim mainland and a tiny rocky island. That is not why it was built. Salmon fishermen first erected a bridge here in 1755 because Cuilcagh Red sits directly in the route of migrating salmon. The island gave fishermen access to nets positioned around what was essentially a natural obstacle in the fish's journey. The fishery could once take hundreds of salmon in a day. By its final season, the entire spring to autumn catch had fallen to only about 250 fish, fewer than the fishery could once land in a single good day. The operation was no longer viable. One of Northern Ireland's most recognizable tourist images is therefore the surviving infrastructure of an industry that largely disappeared because the migration it depended upon declined. 14. Belfast once built objects almost as long as 3 football pitches. Titanic has become so inseparable from its sinking that it is easy to forget what the ship represented before the iceberg. The vessel was built at Harland and Wolff in Belfast and measured about 260 meters long, roughly the length of 3 football pitches laid end to end. It took more than 3 years and tens of millions of working hours from keel laying to completion. Titanic was not an isolated miracle. Belfast yards built Olympic, Britannic, and hundreds of other vessels as part of an industrial system capable of exporting enormous machines across the world. One Harland and Wolff foreman, Robert Falconer Keith, supervised the launches of more than 250 vessels during his career, representing nearly 2.5 million gross tons. Titanic was the famous one. The real surprise is the industrial machine that could build ships like it repeatedly. 13. A mountain wall surrounds Belfast's drinking water. Across the Mourne Mountains runs a granite wall roughly 35 kilometers long. If laid out in a straight line, it would stretch farther than the distance from central Belfast to Lisburn and back again. Instead, it climbs across 15 mountains, and it was constructed by hand between 1904 and 1922. It looks like a boundary between estates, or perhaps an old defensive structure. Its actual purpose was water. The Belfast Water Commissioners bought about 9,000 acres of the High Mournes and enclosed the catchment, feeding what became the Silent Valley and Ben Crom reservoirs. Today, water from this system helps supply more than 250,000 people. The wall is essentially a giant line drawn through the mountains around rainfall. Belfast's growth had created such demand for clean water that the city reached into an entire mountain range and engineered the landscape around its thirst. 12. They built a temporary town inside those mountains. Silent Valley now lives up to its name. During construction, it was anything but silent. Work on the reservoir brought quarries, machinery, a railway, and around 2,000 workers into the Mournes. That was not a small work camp. It was a temporary community large enough to resemble a village, built in a mountain valley for a single engineering project. Workers fought their way through silt, gravel, and enormous boulders beneath the valley before the reservoir was eventually completed in 1933. What now appears to be a remote natural retreat is partly an industrial landscape whose machinery has been removed and whose scars have softened beneath grass and water. Northern Ireland repeatedly does this. Infrastructure disappears into scenery so successfully that the engineering begins to look natural. 11. There are rivers beneath Fermanagh. Water around Cuilcagh can simply disappear from the surface. The reason is beneath your feet. Limestone has been dissolved into an underground network of caves, passages, and rivers around Marble Arch, allowing water to sink underground, travel through darkness, and re-emerge somewhere else entirely. Above it is a landscape of bog, lakes, hills, and farmland. Below it is another drainage system. The landscape became part of something even stranger in 2008, when the Geopark expanded across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Today, Cuilcagh Lakelands is recognized by UNESCO as the world's first transnational global geopark. A political boundary divides the landscape above. The geological system beneath it simply carries on. 10. There is an ancient sea buried beneath County Antrim. Near Carrickfergus, miners descend into rock that began as seawater. During the Triassic, evaporation in restricted basins left thick deposits of halite, or rock salt, beneath what is now eastern County Antrim. Salt extraction around Carrickfergus began in the 19th century, and mining continues at Kilroot. The workings reach roughly 400 meters deep, putting parts of the mine farther below the surface than the Shard in London rises above it, and extend across kilometers underground. Beneath roads, houses, and green fields, therefore lies the residue of an environment that no longer exists. An ancient evaporating sea converted into solid rock and mined more than 200 million years later. And Antrim's buried geology becomes even stranger as you move upwards through time. 9. Northern Ireland was caught in the birth of an ocean. Around 60 million years ago, the map of the world was being rearranged. Greenland and Europe were pulling apart, and the North Atlantic was beginning to open. Enormous quantities of magma rose through weakened crust across what geologists call the North Atlantic Igneous Province. Northern Ireland was sitting inside that event. Lava flooded across Antrim. Magma intruded elsewhere, helping form landscapes including the Mournes and Slieve Gullion. New research published in 2026 indicates that Northern Ireland's major Paleogene volcanic activity was concentrated into roughly 5.5 million years, far shorter than previously thought. The postcard landscapes of the North Coast are not simply scenery produced by some local eruption. They are leftovers from the geological construction of the North Atlantic. 8. The Giant's Causeway is only the cooling pattern. The Giant's Causeway is often treated as if the columns themselves are the geological mystery. They are really the aftermath. Thick basaltic lava cooled, contracted, and fractured, producing tens of thousands of columns. The remarkable geometry came from ordinary physical processes, operating on an extraordinary volume of molten rock. The scale is easier to understand when you reconstruct what was actually there. British Geological Survey research describes lava filling an existing valley until it formed a lava lake around 90 meters deep, roughly the height of a 25-story building. It cooled slowly enough for contraction cracks to propagate through the enormous mass, producing the regular columns exposed today. And the eruption was not continuous. Between major phases of lava, volcanic activity stopped long enough for the surface to weather and support a forested landscape before eruptions buried it again. The causeway is therefore not simply frozen lava. It is one exposed layer in a landscape repeatedly built, weathered, and buried. That changes the scale of the causeway. Those famous hexagons are not an isolated curiosity created on one patch of coast. They are a tiny visible cross-section through a volcanic province that once covered a far larger landscape. The tourist attraction is effectively the cracked surface of the processes that help to build an ocean. 7. The landscape remembers sea levels that no longer exist. Return to Rathlin and the submerged coastline beneath the island starts to make more sense. Northern Ireland's present shoreline is only the latest version. Ice sheets expanded and disappeared, global sea levels changed, and the land itself responded to the enormous weight of ice being added and removed. The evidence survives in raised beaches above today's sea and drowned landforms below it. At Rathlin, cliffs more than 100 meters high stand above old raised beaches, while submerged caves, arches, and coastal features continue offshore. Some of the landscape that once marked the meeting point between land and sea is now above the waves. Other pieces are underneath them. The coastline looks like a boundary. Geologically, it is a moving snapshot. 6. The border was supposed to be reconsidered. Northern Ireland's most famous line on a map is not geological at all, and even that line was once less certain than it now appears. Following partition and the Anglo-Irish Treaty, an Irish Boundary Commission was established to consider adjustments to the frontier between Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. The commission existed because the treaty settlement had left a basic question unresolved: whether the border should remain where partition had placed it or be adjusted according to the wishes of local populations, while also taking economic and geographic conditions into account. That created enormous expectations about potentially substantial transfers of territory. When details of the Commission's recommendations leaked to the press, however, the proposed changes proved far smaller than many had anticipated. When the Commission finally reported in 1925, it recommended relatively minor alterations. Instead of implementing them, the governments involved agreed to retain the existing border. The report itself was not made public until 1969. The line that later became one of the most politically consequential borders in Europe was therefore not simply drawn once and accepted. It survived a process specifically created to reconsider it. 5. The border cannot divide the systems underneath it. In Fermanagh and Cavan, the political frontier cuts across the same limestone, water systems, habitats, and communities. That is precisely why the Cuilcagh Lakelands Geopark eventually crossed it. UNESCO now points to the Geopark as a model of transnational cooperation in a former conflict region. There is something unusually literal about that. Rivers disappear into limestone without checking which jurisdiction they are entering. Aquifers, rock formations, bogs, and wildlife ranges do the same. The border is politically real and historically consequential, but the physical landscape underneath it is older by hundreds of millions of years. Northern Ireland's geography repeatedly refuses to fit neatly inside Northern Ireland. 4. Almost half of Northern Ireland drains towards one lake. At the center of Northern Ireland sits Lough Neagh, the largest freshwater lake in the United Kingdom. It covers about 383 square kilometers, an area more than twice the size of Belfast. Yet its average depth is only around 9 meters, shallower than many ordinary swimming pools are long. Its real scale becomes apparent when you stop looking at the water and look at everything flowing towards it. Even the lake itself has been physically altered. 19th century engineering works lowered Lough Neagh's level, partly to improve drainage, reduce flooding, and reclaim agricultural land. So the enormous hydrological system at the center of Northern Ireland is not entirely natural in its modern form either. Human decisions changed the level of the basin, while the rivers feeding it continued collecting water from thousands of square kilometers around it. Rivers entering Lough Neagh drain about 43% of Northern Ireland, plus territory across the border in County Monaghan. Put another way, rain falling across almost half the country can eventually become part of the same water system. Farms, towns, sewage systems, soils, and rivers that appear geographically separate are therefore connected downstream. Lough Neagh is not simply a lake in Northern Ireland. In hydrological terms, much of Northern Ireland is part of Lough Neagh. 3. That enormous lake is now exposing the cost of the connection. Blue-green algal blooms have turned Lough Neagh into one of Northern Ireland's most visible environmental problems. Nutrients entering waterways can encourage cyanobacterial growth, while environmental conditions affect how severe blooms become. Because the catchment is so large, what happens many kilometers from the shore can eventually matter at the lake. The Northern Ireland Executive approved a Lough Neagh Action Plan in 2024, and by March 2026, the Environment Department said 20 of its actions had been delivered, while another 17 were progressing. Monitoring probes now transmit measurements from the Lough and tributaries at high frequency. The response itself reveals the scale of the problem. Fixing a lake fed by nearly half a country means dealing with the country feeding it. 2. A fish links this inland lake to an ocean thousands of kilometers away. Lough Neagh has another connection that is almost invisible. European eels spend years in freshwater and coastal systems before mature silver eels migrate towards the Atlantic and ultimately the Sargasso Sea to reproduce. The species is now critically endangered, and in 2026, Northern Ireland introduced tighter measures for the Lough Neagh fishery. The yellow eel fishery was closed for 3 years, and the permitted catch was restricted to 25 tons of silver eels. Their journey makes the connection even larger than it first sounds. European eels arriving in systems such as Lough Neagh begin life as larvae carried from the Sargasso Sea towards Europe. After reaching freshwater, they may spend between 5 and 20 years growing before changing again and beginning the return migration as silver eels. An animal can therefore spend a substantial part of its life in a northern Irish lake before beginning a migration measured across an ocean. The eel growing in Lough Neagh and the eel crossing the Atlantic are different stages of the same extraordinary life cycle. That means a creature living in the largest freshwater lake in the UK belongs to a biological system extending far beyond the British Isles. The same landscape that refuses to obey the border also refuses to stop at the coast. Water connects Northern Ireland internally. Migration connects it to an ocean. 1. Northern Ireland is not really a small place. On a political map, Northern Ireland looks compact. 6 counties occupying the northeast of an island, surrounded by a border and a coastline. But almost everything in this countdown has exposed a different geography. The basalt at the Giant's Causeway belongs to the opening of the North Atlantic. The salt beneath Antrim belongs to vanished Triassic seas. The hills beneath ancient ceremonial sites were shaped by ice. The underground rivers of Fermanagh cross a frontier created only in the 20th century. Rathlin's seabed preserves shorelines from different sea levels. Eels leave Lough Neagh and enter an ocean-scale migration, while rain falling across almost half of Northern Ireland converges on the same shallow lake. Even the human landscape works this way. Belfast shipyards built vessels for global routes. Its demand for water reshaped the Mournes. A dozen imported squirrels altered an island's ecology. A border created by politics cuts through geological and ecological systems that existed long before the states on either side of it. That is the hidden pattern. Northern Ireland is small only if you measure the outline. Its landscapes were assembled by oceans opening, ice sheets moving, seas disappearing, rivers cutting underground, and people repeatedly drawing new systems across much older ones. And those systems are still active. Water still moves towards Lough Neagh. Cliffs still erode. Wildlife still crosses boundaries. Pollution travels downstream. The Atlantic still presses against a coastline that has never been fixed. The strange thing about Northern Ireland is not that such a small place contains an unusual number of stories. It is that the place was never as self-contained as the map makes it appear. The deeper you look, the more every boundary starts to disappear. Which one surprised you most? And if there is a place in Northern Ireland with a story people outside the area never hear, put it in the comments. There is clearly plenty left beneath the surface.